A lot of this reframing that I want to do of bullying and aggression between kids really, for me, has been informed by Brene Brown's work. And again, if you're not familiar with her, I would really encourage you to find some of her books. Daring Greatly is awesome. It's not an easy sit-down read necessarily, but it's really good. And I've had a lot of clients that really enjoyed that for themselves too. When we're talking about kids that are intentionally trying to have power over others, and that is a pattern of behavior, ultimately what we're talking about is a fear of any kind of vulnerability, a fear of not being good enough, of not being considered really worthy of true belonging, connection, and not feeling a sense of connection. And this experimentation of power. One of the interesting experiences I get to have as a parent is being with my son's on swim team. And so for summer swim team, we have this lovely assignment that you can sign up for called Blanket Parent. Anybody know what that is? So when you go to a swim meet, all the kids of a certain age group are supposed to sit together so that when it's time for their events, you can just send them. And so every week, or at least once or twice a week now for the summer, that's what I've signed up for because I get to sit in a chair and not out in the heat. So it's a great assignment. But I also get the opportunity to sit and observe 10, 12-year-old boys sitting in a group together for 5 hours at a time. You talk about opportunities to observe coercive behavior and all sorts of social dynamics happening between these kids, and they're all good kids. But what's interesting to me is this like jockeying for who's the leader and who's in power and what do they say to each other, and this dance that happens so often. And the ones that really seem to get this like anxiety about them, even though they wouldn't really call it anxiety, as they're kind of doing the jockeying for power back and forth. And so this week, the thing that I was laughing at the most was this is truly an example of creativity to some extent too, because they're pulling these strands of grass and making like crowns for each other. And then there's a battle over who gets a crown from whom. And so that's your signal of your status within the group. If so-and-so makes a crown and gives it to this person, then, okay, well, And then, of course, they're, out in their swimsuits, so they're like, strutting around with their little grass crown. And there's so many subtle things that happen in those kinds of group interactions. And it's interesting for me to have conversations with my son about, so who here's friends at school and who really isn't, and like really understanding the group dynamics of it. And I'm sure at some point he's like, okay, Mom, just stop and let me play my game. But it really is interesting. But so much of what I'm observing in that group is that experimentation with power and experimentation with how I feel a sense of belonging within this group, and making that distinction between really feeling a belonging versus feeling like I'm fitting in. And the distinction between that really is whether it's genuinely who I am. If I'm doing something to fit in, then that's not something that feels genuine within me. It's not something that feels really authentic. And so I'm wearing a mask, and I might not be really aware that I'm wearing a mask because I like the way it feels to be accepted. But eventually, if what I'm doing to fit in is really not congruent with me and who I am, then I'm going to start to feel something icky around that. And there's, I won't go into that too much more, but I think part of what we do for really creating a different kind of culture for our kids is really figuring out ways where they can feel like they belong somewhere. And ideally, that at least they belong at home, that there's a sense of belonging and true connection there. And that's where it starts. And then if they at least feel a sense of belonging at home, then they know what that feels like, and then they can be gravitating toward that in other situations too. So I want to take a break from the PowerPoint for a second. This is one of my favorite books to read for kids, and really kids at all ages. If I read this with adolescents, I always kind of apologize. Like, I know it's kind of a silly kid book, but I want you to just let yourself be a kid for a minute and let's talk about buckets. And interestingly enough, it's on YouTube being read aloud, so we're going to just listen.
How full is your bucket?
So one thing to say real quickly before we watch this, as you're listening to this story that is talking about how full your bucket is for a kid, I want you to think about this as far as being able to connect it to really how we're trying to reframe bullying and how we could help kids understand that different paradigm this way.
How full is your bucket? For kids. Written by Tom Rath and Mary Reckmeyer. Illustrated by Maury J. Manning. Felix was putting one of the last blocks on his tower when his little sister came in. "I want to build with you," she said. Felix scowled. "Go away! You're too little." "I'm big!" "Ugh, stay back! You'll knock it over!" "I can be very careful." "Go play with your baby toys, Anna." "Felix." Thwack! "Grandpa!" Grandpa shook his head. "Felix, you just dipped from your sister's bucket. Like everyone else, Anna has an invisible bucket. When it's empty, she feels bad. But when it's full, she feels great. Didn't you ever notice your own bucket?" Invisible bucket? Huh. Sometimes Felix couldn't quite tell when his grandfather was joking. But the next morning when Felix woke up, there it was. A small gray bucket floating above his head. When Felix came down to have breakfast, his mom was in a hurry. "I've got a meeting this morning, and it's almost time to go. Anna, sit still!" Felix slipped, and choco wheat scattered across the floor. "Felix!" yelled his mom. "You should have used the stool to reach that!" Felix could feel his bucket tip, and big, invisible drips spilled out. Drip, drip. "Ha ha!" Anna laughed as she crunched the cereal with her shoe. Drip. "Get the broom and clean that up before you miss the bus," scolded Mom. With the school bus honking, Felix quickly swept up the choco wheats and grabbed the last blueberry muffin. But before he could even take one bite, Buster jumped up and grabbed the muffin from his hand. Drip. "Hey, look at Felix's new backpack. Ha, my baby brother has one just like it." Drip. Psst, Felix, nobody's talking about that. Drip. "Watch out, shrimp." Drip. It was still morning, and Felix's bucket felt almost empty. As he watched his classmates walk into the room, he secretly hoped they would trip and fall. That's what it feels like when you have an empty bucket. Felix slumped into his seat and waited for something else bad to happen. Mrs. Bumblenickel walked slowly up to his desk and handed him a paper. Oh, he could hardly bear to look. Felix, you wrote a wonderful story. Would you please share it with the class? Felix grinned and felt a big drop land right in his bucket. Drop. The Gigantosaurus Who Wanted a Pet, by me, Felix. The class grew quiet. They laughed at all the right places and oohed at the scary parts. When Felix finally read the end, everyone clapped, even Emily, who sat next to him and didn't usually like dinosaurs. Felix felt a whole shower of drops land in his bucket. Drop. Maybe the day wouldn't be so bad after all. Drop. Team captains today are Veronica and Felix. Drop. Nice cow. It's a dog. Well, nice colors there, Felix. Cool laser ant backpack, Felix. By afternoon, Felix's bucket was nearly full. At recess, when he looked around, Felix suddenly realized that his grandpa was right. Everyone else had a bucket too. Hey, here's your baseball catch. Thanks, dude. Hi, I'm Felix. First day? Yes, I'm Amir. The strange thing was that for every drop he helped put in someone else's bucket, he felt another drop in his own bucket. When Felix burst in the door after school, he shouted, "You were right, Grandpa! I do have a bucket, and I understand how it works!" Then he saw Anna's torn doll. "Bad dog," he almost scolded. But then he thought, dogs might have invisible buckets too. "Your doll will be okay, Anna," said Felix. "Mom will fix her." Until then, do you want to help me build the tallest building in the world with my blocks? And so they did.
How does this connect to bullying and way kids treat each other, way we treat kids?
I was just watching it and noticing how, it's felt really crappy to being crappy to all the other kids, but needed a reminder.
One of the things that's almost universal is, as I use this, one of the interventions that I use with kids a lot as we read this book is then we make their own bucket, on a piece of paper, and then you can make columns of what are the things that happen that fill your bucket, and what are the things that happen even through this day that have emptied your bucket, and start looking at those side by side and sharing that with parents so that parents can become more aware of what they're doing that is contributing to each column. And then talking a lot about with kids, what does it feel like to have an empty bucket? How can you identify that you have an empty bucket, and know that that's why you're feeling what you're feeling? And almost universally, irritable and mean are some of the things that come out. like he says in the book, when his bucket was empty, he's sitting in his classroom secretly wishing that somebody around him is going to trip and fall. And that is so common of a way that we, I mean, I think to some extent as adults even, begin to feel when our bucket's empty. And certainly for kids that don't have the emotional maturity to really recognize, okay, I just need to take a break. Because really for them, they don't have the power to say, you know what, I just need a timeout right now. And I need to be in a place by myself. And we don't give them that option. They're forced to just keep going throughout the rest of the day as if they don't have those emotions. And so it's often that's going to get acted out. Other observations? Or
I was going to ask a question. How does, there's this kind of balance between being a part of a larger group or being a part of, especially like in teenage years versus having your own identity and all the sort of cultural or shoes you should wear or clothes you should wear. How do you see that fitting into?
That plays a huge role, I mean, especially in different ways depending on what school you're in. If you're in a high affluency school, then if you don't have, it's amazing how many times I've heard kids talk about, they're upset with their parent because their parent wouldn't buy them this like Tory Burch $400 backpack for high school. I'm like, are you kidding me? That's expected? What? Or who's got the latest iPhone, or who's got all of the status stuff. And then in other areas where it's not really an option for many kids to have a Tory Burch backpack, then it goes into more kind of subtle signals to each other as far as like what color shoes you're wearing, or even in schools where there's uniforms that are enforced that try to make it so standard across the board. There's all sorts of ways that it's still apparent that you can establish your status, and I think that all goes back to the drive that we all have of wanting to feel a sense of belonging. And if that's where we're feeling that, then it's going to be a perpetual sense of striving for that and not ever achieving it. Because even if I get that wonderful new backpack that makes me feel great for a day, then the next day there's something new that comes out that I want that I might be told I can't have, hopefully. And anyway, so I see that playing out in different ways depending on the socioeconomic culture that they're in, especially. And it really feeding into that sense of identity, but how we as parents interact with kids around that, really, we're creating the narrative with them about what that means. Or we're not, or we're letting their friends create that for them. And hopefully, if a school is recognizing that kind of dynamic is happening, then it can be something that is addressed within that larger culture too.